The morning I parked across from Logan Mercer's farmhouse and realized something felt wrong. For weeks, I had rehearsed that drive in my head. I knew every turn on the back roads outside Franklin, Tennessee. I knew exactly what I wanted to say when I finally stood face to face with the man who had helped tear apart my marriage. At least, I thought I did. I arrived just after sunrise. The fields surrounding the property were covered in a thin layer of fog, and the gravel driveway looked untouched except for one thing: a moving truck. It sat beside the house with its rear door rolled open. Half-packed boxes were stacked near the garage. A dining table leaned against the wall under a tarp. It looked less like someone settling into a life, and more like someone trying to disappear from one. I stayed behind the wheel with the engine running. This wasn't what I expected. I had imagined anger, excuses, maybe a confrontation that had been building for months. Instead, the farmhouse looked abandoned. The curtains were shut tight. No lights were on. No movement behind the windows. I checked the address again, even though I already knew it was right. Logan Mercer lived here. Or at least he had. The longer I sat there, the stronger the feeling became. Something about the scene didn't fit the story I had spent weeks constructing in my head. Because men who win don't usually leave town. And men hiding affairs don't usually look like they're running from something. For the first time since I discovered my wife's betrayal, I found myself wondering if I was missing a piece of the puzzle. Sitting there across from that farmhouse, watching the morning sun creep across the fields, I realized a possibility I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Maybe Logan Mercer wasn't the person I thought he was. And maybe the truth about my marriage was a lot bigger than an affair. Until a few months earlier, my life in Franklin, Tennessee, had been painfully ordinary, and I mean that in the best possible way. I worked as an operations manager for a construction company that handled commercial projects across Middle Tennessee. My days started before sunrise and usually ended with paperwork spread across the kitchen table. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave my family a stable life. My wife, Brooke, managed corporate events for a luxury hotel in Nashville. She was organized, ambitious, and good with people in ways I never was. Where I preferred schedules and spreadsheets, she thrived in crowded rooms full of strangers. Together, we built what looked like a solid life. We had 2 kids, a mortgage, weekend soccer games, vacation plans pinned to the refrigerator, the usual disagreements about money, chores, and whose turn it was to drive across town for practice. Nothing about us seemed unusual, at least from the outside. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs scattered throughout those final years like nails left behind on a job site. Brooke started taking more late-night calls. At first, they sounded work-related. Then they became private conversations held behind closed doors. Weekend commitments appeared on her calendar with little explanation. Business trips became more frequent. Sometimes she would leave the house saying she needed to meet a client and return hours later with details that never quite added up. I noticed every one of those changes. The problem wasn't that I missed them. The problem was that I explained them away. Every marriage goes through busy seasons, I told myself. Her career was growing. The hotel industry demanded flexibility. There was always a reasonable explanation available, and I accepted each one because questioning them meant questioning something much larger. Questioning them meant questioning my marriage. And at the time, believing the comfortable version of reality felt a lot easier than examining the uncomfortable one. I had no idea that while I was protecting my peace of mind, the truth was quietly building beneath the surface. The shift started with something so small I almost ignored it. One Saturday afternoon, I was loading luggage back into our garage after a family trip. As I emptied one of the suitcases, my phone connected to an AirTag that should have been inside the bag. Curious, I opened the tracking history. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed a location I didn't recognize. A lakeside property nearly 40 minutes outside Franklin. I assumed it was a mistake. The tag must have been detected by another nearby device. Maybe the map data was wrong. There were dozens of harmless explanations, and I accepted the easiest one without much thought. Then it happened again. A few days later, I checked the location history and saw the same area appear. The cabin. A week after that, it appeared again. And again, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The strange part was that Brooke was supposedly working during many of those visits. According to her schedule, she was attending meetings, coordinating events, or managing hotel functions in Nashville. The map told a different story. For several days, I fought against what the evidence suggested. I searched for alternate explanations. Maybe a client owned the property. Maybe the hotel hosted retreats there. Maybe there was some professional reason for the repeated trips. But every explanation felt weaker than the one before it. Without telling anyone, I started paying closer attention. I watched departure times. I compared calendars. I checked receipts. I listened more carefully when Brooke talked about her day. The details didn't match. Small inconsistencies began stacking on top of each other. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would convince a stranger. But enough to convince me that something wasn't right. The hardest part wasn't discovering new information. The hardest part was realizing that the story I had believed for years no longer fit the facts in front of me. And once that realization settled in, I couldn't force myself to believe it anymore. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. The moment I accepted reality wasn't dramatic. There was no explosive argument, no shocking confession, no single piece of evidence that suddenly made everything clear. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening while I sat alone in my truck outside a grocery store parking lot. Brooke had told me she was working late again. The AirTag showed the cabin. I remember staring at the steering wheel and realizing I was exhausted. Not physically, mentally. I was tired of inventing explanations. Tired of forcing pieces together that clearly didn't belong in the same puzzle. For months, I had been fighting the possibility that my marriage wasn't what I believed it was. That evening, I stopped fighting. The truth hadn't fully revealed itself yet, but I knew enough. Something significant was happening, and whatever it was, pretending otherwise wouldn't change it. When I drove home that night, nothing looked different. The kids were finishing homework at the kitchen table. Dinner dishes sat in the sink. The television played quietly in the living room. From the outside, our family appeared exactly the same. Inside, everything had changed. I made a decision that would shape every step that followed. I wasn't going to confront Brooke. Not yet. I wasn't going to accuse anyone. I wasn't going to demand explanations from people who were already hiding things. Instead, I would observe. I would listen. I would verify every assumption before acting on it. The emotional part of me wanted immediate answers. The practical part understood that answers gathered in anger were rarely reliable. So I stayed quiet. I still packed school lunches. I still attended soccer games. I still sat across from Brooke at dinner and asked about her day. Outwardly, I remained the same husband and father. Internally, I had crossed a line I could never uncross. For the first time, I accepted that discovering the truth might destroy everything I thought my life was. And I accepted something else as well. If that happened, I would rather face reality completely than spend another year living inside a comforting lie. Over the following weeks, observation became my routine. I wasn't looking for dramatic discoveries anymore. I was looking for patterns. Patterns rarely lie. Every morning, I left for work as usual. Every evening, I returned home and acted as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, I quietly documented timelines, locations, phone records, and inconsistencies that most people would have dismissed. The more information I collected, the stranger the situation became. Brooke had become extremely careful with her phone. Call logs disappeared regularly. Text conversations vanished within hours. Notifications were disabled. Passwords changed without explanation. At first, that seemed predictable. People hiding affairs usually hide communication. But then I started finding traces elsewhere. A secondary email account appeared on a shared device. Social media profiles with limited visibility surfaced under variations of her name. Messaging applications I had never seen before appeared briefly and then disappeared. Every answer uncovered 2 new questions. Then I discovered something I wasn't expecting. Logan Mercer had attempted to end the relationship. The evidence wasn't direct at first. A canceled reservation. Several unanswered messages. Repeated gaps in communication. Then eventually, through information I gathered from overlapping timelines and records, a picture began to emerge. The contact wasn't being driven by him anymore. Brooke kept finding ways to reconnect. She initiated conversations. She arranged meetings. She continued pursuing contact after periods of silence. That discovery forced me to reconsider everything. Until then, I had imagined a familiar story. Married woman meets another man. An affair develops. Both participants willingly continue. Simple. Painful, but simple. What I was seeing looked different. Logan wasn't behaving like someone aggressively pursuing another man's wife. If anything, there were signs he was pulling away. Yet the relationship somehow continued. The deeper I looked, the less the situation resembled the narrative I had created in my head. I still believed Brooke was betraying our marriage. Nothing changed that fact. But for the first time, I started wondering whether Logan Mercer understood the full reality of what was happening. And that question would eventually lead me straight to his farmhouse. What started as a private problem gradually spread into every corner of my life. For a while, I convinced myself I could keep everything contained. I would gather information, protect the kids from the fallout, and continue functioning until I understood the full truth. Reality had other plans. The first cracks appeared at work. Construction projects depend on focus. Small mistakes become expensive ones. I had always been reliable, the guy who remembered deadlines, budgets, and details without writing them down. Suddenly, I was forgetting things. Nothing catastrophic. A missed call here. An overlooked email there. Enough for people to notice. My supervisor pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if everything was all right. I told him I was tired. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. At home, the children sensed changes before anyone said a word. Kids noticed tension the way animals sense storms. They started asking why Mom was working so much. Why dinner felt quiet. Why I seemed distracted. I answered carefully, determined not to drag them into adult problems they couldn't understand. Meanwhile, Brooke began creating a different kind of damage. As I continued piecing together timelines, I discovered she was telling completely different stories to different people. Some friends believed we were already separated. Others thought we were going through counseling and rebuilding our marriage. A few seemed convinced we were happier than ever. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. At first, I assumed she was simply protecting her image. Then I realized something more troubling. Each version of the story served a specific purpose. Different people received different realities depending on what she needed them to believe. The deception had expanded far beyond the affair itself. It had become a network of carefully managed narratives. And maintaining those narratives required constant adjustments, new explanations, and additional lies. The farther I looked beyond my marriage, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about control. And sooner or later, every system built on conflicting stories collapses under its own weight. When Logan Mercer finally opened the front door, he didn't look anything like the man I had imagined during months of anger. He looked exhausted. The farmhouse behind him was half empty. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway. Furniture had been wrapped in plastic. Dusty rectangles marked the walls where pictures had recently hung. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I had spent weeks preparing for confrontation. Instead, I found myself standing in front of a man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in months. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice wasn't defensive. It was cautious. I introduced myself. The reaction was immediate. The color drained from his face. For a moment, I thought he might close the door. Instead, he stepped aside. We sat across from each other at a nearly empty kitchen table. The room felt temporary, as if the house itself had already accepted its owner was leaving. The silence stretched between us. Then Logan said something that changed everything. "Brooke told me you already knew." I stared at him. Knew what? His expression shifted instantly. Confusion, then concern, then realization. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Over the next hour, neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us argued. We simply compared facts, dates, conversations, trips, promises. The more we talked, the clearer the picture became. Brooke had been telling different stories to each of us. She told Logan we were separated. She told me she was committed to repairing our marriage. She told mutual acquaintances entirely different versions of reality. Every contradiction I had uncovered suddenly connected. Logan wasn't the architect of some secret relationship. He had been operating with information carefully selected for him, just like I had. At one point, he rubbed both hands across his face and stared at the table. "I tried ending it," he said quietly. "I know." His eyes lifted. That answer seemed to surprise him more than anything else. For the first time since discovering the affair, I wasn't speaking to an enemy. I was speaking to another person who had been manipulated by the same source. And as the truth slowly unraveled between us, I realized the story I believed for months had never actually existed. After my meeting with Logan, events began moving without much help from me. For months, I had felt responsible for uncovering every detail myself. I chased timelines, compared records, and questioned every inconsistency. Now, for the first time, the truth seemed capable of advancing on its own. Information started surfacing from multiple directions. Logan shared messages I had never seen. I provided timelines he didn't know existed. Together, the gaps became smaller. The picture became clearer. Meanwhile, Brooke continued trying to maintain the different versions of reality she had built around herself. The problem was that those realities were beginning to collide. People who had received conflicting stories started talking to one another. Questions emerged. Dates stopped matching. Explanations required new explanations. The pressure grew steadily. Counseling sessions became particularly revealing. For months, therapy had felt like an exercise in circling around obvious problems without addressing them directly. Every conversation seemed designed to avoid the central issue. That changed after I organized everything. I carried a black notebook into one session and placed it on the table between us. Inside were timelines, reservation records, email accounts, location histories, documented inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic, just facts. The therapist looked at the notebook. Brooke looked at it too. Neither of them opened it immediately. I remember sitting there quietly before finally saying the only thing that mattered. I came here hoping you'd prove me wrong. The room went silent. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, because the statement was true. For months, I had searched for an explanation that would preserve the life I thought I had. Every new discovery had reduced that possibility. Eventually, reality became impossible to negotiate with. What followed required very little effort from me. The facts spoke for themselves. Questions received incomplete answers. Incomplete answers exposed contradictions. Contradictions exposed larger problems. The process wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, almost mechanical, like watching a structure fail after years of hidden damage. And for the first time since this began, I stopped trying to force outcomes. The truth no longer needed my help. It was doing its own work. By the time divorce proceedings officially began, I was no longer chasing answers. That surprised me. For months, I had convinced myself that understanding every detail would somehow bring peace. If I could uncover every conversation, every decision, every lie, then maybe the pain would make sense. It didn't work that way. The deeper truth was much simpler. No amount of information could restore trust once it had been broken. As the legal process moved forward, relationships around us shifted. Some friends quietly disappeared. Others chose sides without fully understanding the situation. A few surprised me by refusing to participate in the gossip at all. I learned quickly that divorce reveals people just as effectively as betrayal does. The children remained my primary focus. Whatever frustration I carried toward Brooke, I refused to place that burden on them. They deserved stability. They deserved parents who could at least behave like adults in the same room. That became my standard. Not perfection, not friendship, just maturity. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. The anger faded. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It simply became harder to maintain. Anger requires energy. So does obsession. For a long time, I had been feeding both. Replaying conversations. Re-examining timelines. Searching for explanations. Eventually, I realized none of it changed the outcome. The marriage was over. The facts were already established. The future would not improve because I spent another year looking backward. That realization created space for something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not happiness. Not yet. Just relief. The constant need to solve the puzzle finally disappeared. And with it went the belief that closure depended on someone else's actions. Brooke couldn't give me closure. Logan couldn't give me closure. The courts couldn't give me closure. Closure wasn't hidden inside another conversation or another confession. It was a decision. A choice to stop carrying questions that no longer served a purpose. Once I understood that, moving forward became much easier. Not because the past changed, because my relationship with it finally did. The last time I saw Brooke unexpectedly was nearly a year later at our son's baseball tournament. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. Parents filled the bleachers. Kids chased foul balls beyond the outfield fence. Life moved forward the way it always does, regardless of whether you're ready for it. I spotted her near the concession stand between innings. For a moment, neither of us approached. Then she walked over. The conversation was shorter than I expected. There were no arguments left. No negotiations. No competing versions of reality. For the first time since everything began, Brooke spoke plainly. She admitted the affair. She admitted the lies. She admitted manipulating situations and people in ways she could no longer justify. No excuses. No blame. No attempt to rewrite history. I listened quietly. When she finished, I thanked her for finally being honest. Then I wished her well. That was it. As I walked back toward the field, our son stepped into the batter's box. The crowd settled. The pitcher delivered the next pitch. Life continued. And standing there in the afternoon sun, I realized something important. The story I had been trying so hard to understand was over. But my story wasn't. It was simply becoming a different one. And for the first time in a very long while, I was looking forward to what came next.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.